Good evening, everybody. How are you? Great. Well, welcome to the Library and Archives of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm Andy Leach, Director of the Library and Archives. I want to thank you all for being here at tonight's event, which is part of the Rock Hall's joint lecture series with the American Musicological Society. Our special guest tonight is Mark Clague of the University of Michigan, and Mark's lecture tonight is titled "This is America, Jimi Hendrix's Reimaginings of the Star-Spangled Banner as Social Comment for Woodstock and Beyond," and we're really looking forward to hearing that. Mark did research here in the Library and Archives yesterday, so we're going to hear a little bit about that as well. Tonight's event is streaming online, so for those of you in the room here, your image or your voice may appear online, so be aware of that. Before we start, I want to mention a few things. First, for those who don't know, the Library and Archives has been here for 3 years. How many of you have been here before? Excellent, it's a lot of you. How many of you have been to other events like this, or one of these AMS events? Okay, excellent. Welcome back. We opened in 2012. We're free and open to everyone, from scholars to teachers and students to music fans. We have library materials as well as archival materials ranging from documents, photos, to audio and video and posters and so on. So all those things are here to be used by anybody who wants to use them. So we hope to see you here again to do that. Just to tell you about a few things coming up at the Rock Hall. For those who don't know, maybe none of you know this, but the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions are back here in Cleveland this year. Good news, yeah. Got some great inductees this year and some great people we recently announced who are inducting those people, including Paul McCartney inducting Ringo Starr, so that should be very fun. We're kicking that week off with a free day, community free day, Saturday, April 11th, and that's all day, and we'll have 2 stages of live music, lots of films, family activities, lots of education programming, and our new inductees exhibit will open that day as well. That'll culminate that night in the Cleveland Indians Rock and Blast, which will include fireworks at 8 o'clock back in Voinovich Park right behind the museum. Some other things a little bit before that, we'll have the Moondog Coronation Ball with Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Smokey Robinson. That's on April 4th. Our Rock My Soul, a gospel music celebration, will honor Andre Crouch this year, and that'll be on April 12th. It's sold out, but it'll be streaming live on rockhall.com. And then the Sonic Sessions, which is our new concert series, and that'll be with this very cool band Foxygen that you should check out if you haven't heard them. And that'll be on April 14th. All of our education efforts, like tonight, all of our public events are made possible through the support of our members. How many of you are members? All right, well, thank you. We really appreciate your support. How many, let's see, basically, being a member is a great way to stay connected to what's happening at the museum and here at the Library and Archives, and to get advance notice of our events like this one. So we really encourage you to become a member. At this point, I want to bring out our Director of Education, Jason Hanley, who will tell you a little bit more about the collaboration with AMS, and he'll introduce tonight's special guest. And please join me in welcoming Jason.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Great to see such a good crowd here at the Library and Archive. As Andy mentioned, this lecture series is part of one we do with the American Musicological Society, and we're really happy to be a co-presenter and host for this event. It's a fantastic way to bring a lot of scholars who are working in the field of popular music studies, focusing on rock and roll and what we celebrate and honor here at the museum and the library, to bring them to Cleveland to present in a public forum and talk about some of the great research that's going on and what's happening. I want to just also again thank Bob Judd from the American Musicological Society, who's done a great job of helping us with this series and putting it together. So a little bit about our speaker tonight. Mark Clague researches all forms of music making in the United States, with his recent projects focusing on the United States national anthem, which we're going to hear quite a bit about tonight. He also has worked on American orchestras as institutions, especially in early Chicago and San Francisco. He's worked on the Atlanta School of Composers, sacred harp music and performance, critical editing, and the music of George and Ira Gershwin. Mark Clague is a associate professor of musicology with tenure in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan, where he also serves as the director of research for the department and is co-director of its American Music Institute. And I should mention briefly, quickly too, originally we had Stephanie Harriger, who's our education programs manager at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, scheduled to do this introduction because she's a former student of Mark's. So she was hoping to be here. Unfortunately, she's sick. One of you, being local Clevelanders here, will understand there's a bug going around, so be careful. But I was instructed by Stephanie to attempt to say "Go Blue" as many times as I possibly could tonight. Being a Clevelander, that's hard for me to do, Mark, so appreciate it while it's coming. Before joining Michigan's faculty, Mark Clague served as executive director for Music of the United States of America, a series of scholarly editions of American music published by AR Editions for the American Musicological Society. He also held editorial positions for the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago, where he helped complete the International Dictionary of Black Composers under the direction of Dr. Samuel Floyd. We were talking earlier today too, Mark was saying that, he's excited to be here and presenting at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, especially for a guy whose main instrument is bassoon, and Mark has performed as a bassoonist in many times previous to this, and again has taught many students who have gone on to teach and work at other universities, including Stephanie Harriger. A little bit about tonight. We were even discussing in the car earlier today as we were here at the library and out at Case Western Reserve University, some of how this project got started for Mark. And the idea that he was originally teaching a course on Intro to American Music. And he was really trying to think about American identity and how music could comment and shape on that. And the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem, seemed like a really great place to start. And he was looking for some original recordings of the Star-Spangled Banner and having a hard time finding a lot of those, which led him to a project where he actually recorded and put together a lot of different versions of that. And he now also was one of the co-founders, right, of the Star-Spangled Music Foundation, and they put out a great piece called Poets and Patriots, A Tuneful History of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is a great 2-CD set where you can go through some of the different versions of that have been done over the years. He also, of course, used Jimi Hendrix version in that class as a doorway for students to think about the Star-Spangled Banner, a version of it that doesn't have any words in it, but what that meant about American identity, what that said about it. And also I want to point out too, there's a website, it's www.starspangledmusic.org, and Mark and I were talking a lot about the great work you're doing for K-12 students, right? That this CD is really a resource for the classroom, for teachers to use it as a way to talk about music and get that into the classroom. So great work he's doing there in public musicology of getting his work out and taught in classrooms. So without further ado, we're going to hear tonight about Jimi Hendrix versions of the Star-Spangled Banner. Please give a warm Rock and Roll Hall of Fame welcome for Mark Clague.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate you stealing all my good lines. That was really nice of you. Let me get set up here, but it's a real thrill for me to be here, and just thanks to the AMS and Bob Judd and Ellen Harris, who's the president of AMS, for making this possible, and Jason and Andy and really all the folks at the Rock Hall and the Library and Archives here for just an incredible experience. I actually came to the Rock Hall not long, it's probably my 4th or 5th time being here, but not long after it opened, brought my kids to SeaWorld, if you remember, that was not very far from here. And they were exhausted right after lunch, and so I rushed back to the hotel, and I put them and my wife down for a nap, and then I ran over here and spent the afternoon at the Rock Hall. So it was that was my first experience. But it's at that time I remember the Bruce Springsteen flag really dominating the whole pyramid. So I think that's one of the reasons why I've always thought of the Star-Spangled Banner and the Rock Hall together. And it's just a real thrill to be part of this series, and thank you all so much for coming. I also want to thank Mark Katz and Will Robin, who helped put this article together. So the talk I'm giving today is really connected to this article, which was in the Journal of the Society for American Music end of last year. So, and this is a picture by a friend of mine, Lenny Sinclair. You may really should bring out to the Rock Hall to talk at some point, but a rock photographer in Detroit. She was affiliated with Translove Energies and that whole scene around the MC5. So anyway, it's just an incredible experience to be here and to, be in the same building as the original lyrics to Purple Haze, and to have spent most of the day looking at a lot of Jimmy's outfits and drawings and just all the incredible resources you have here in Cleveland. So thanks very much for the opportunity. So as Andy said, my talk today is titled "This is America, Jimi Hendrix's Reimaginings of the Star-Spangled Banner as Social Comment for Woodstock and Beyond." And so I guess I'll get this. I just promised that I wouldn't go to sleep, and now I'm breaking my promise. There we go. Does that work? Okay, here we go. The sheer emotional impact of Jimi Hendrix's Woodstock rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner sparked my own fascination. His squealing guitar effects, depicting the incoming descent of bombs that were soon bursting in air, grabbed me especially as intensified on the festival's documentary film, when Hendrix lip-synced the resulting cries and screams. His performance makes the abstract only too human. For me, Hendrix's Woodstock anthem of August 18, 1969 remains atop the list of the most powerful performances of Francis Scott Key's song ever created. Yet, by placing another tune, the Civil War elegy Taps, inside his anthem arrangement, Hendrix provokes some critical questions. Specifically, what, if anything, does his rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner mean? And how did his arrangement come to be? As I explored the literature on Hendrix, it became apparent that there were already many answers to these questions. Among some of the most eloquent examples of rock criticism, the explications of Hendrix's Woodstock anthem offer important insights into the guitarist's artistry and thought. The problem is that these discussions are often contradictory. Writing in the book Crosstown Traffic, Jimi Hendrix and the Post-War Rock and Roll Revolution, Charles Shaar Murray states, quote, "The Hendrix Star-Spangled Banner is probably the most complex and powerful work of American art to deal with the Vietnam War," end quote. In contrast, Hendrix biographer Charles Cross instead claims that Hendrix's banner was not political at all. In his biography, Room Full of Mirrors, Cross observes, quote, "For Jimi, the Star-Spangled Banner was a musical exercise, not a manifesto," end quote. Los Angeles Times music critic Pete Johnson, however, heard Hendrix's anthem as neither artistic nor intellectually serious. He called it meaningless and the cheapest kind of sensationalism. My intent here is not to diminish the views of these noted authors, who each have much to say about Hendrix, his treatment of the national anthem, and rock music generally. Rather, I want to suggest that the many valences and meanings of Hendrix's anthem performances call for a broader understanding of the psychedelic guitarist, musical and social project. Rather than impenetrable or contradictory, I want to suggest that analyses of Hendrix's performances, and here I intentionally emphasize the plural, can clarify our understanding. I want to make two primary interventions in search of this understanding. The first is to dispel any remnants of the myth that the Woodstock banner was a singular, unplanned, ecstatic improvisation. Hendrix's performance of the anthem at Woodstock was indeed inspired, but it represents just the midpoint of the guitarist's 2-year almost obsession with the motion of anthems generally, and Francis Scott Key's song in particular. Rather than a single explosive event, the combination of Jimi Hendrix and the Star-Spangled Banner is most revealingly understood as not a thing, but as a simmering process of mourning, celebration, critique, and activism, beginning in August 1968, a year before Woodstock, and continuing to August 1970, a year after Woodstock and just a month before Hendrix's death. While records are not entirely complete, we know that Hendrix's Woodstock anthem is just the best remembered of at least 60 performances or quotes of the Star-Spangled Banner melody that he performed. Some 40 of these renditions have survived on recordings, a few commercial releases, but more often on bootleg audience tapes. My main task today will be to compare his iconic Woodstock performance to these other surviving recordings to suggest that the Woodstock banner was designed from a pre-composed set of possibilities. Further, surviving recordings of Hendrix's other anthem renditions define the extremes, both critical and patriotic, of his anthem discourse. Comparison places the Woodstock performance firmly in the middle of Hendrix's expressive range, as essentially a combination of both protest and patriotism. The audience tapes that make possible an examination of so many variants of Hendrix's Star-Spangled arrangement also make possible my second intervention, as these tapes preserve the stage banter that Hendrix used to introduce his performances of the anthem. If we take these words at face value, they reveal Hendrix to be a thoughtful respondent to contemporary issues of politics, art, and American society. Considered alongside his musical performances, his stage banter suggests that for Hendrix, the Star-Spangled Banner might be thought of as a sonic snapshot of the nation, a picture taken repeatedly and often to catalog the state of the country and to call for change. He pictured a nation at war, a nation struggling with race and violence, awash in commercialism, but sometimes, as at Woodstock, a nation coming closer to realizing a dream. Ultimately, listeners can find a range of responses within the rich semantic tapestry woven by Hendrix as superstar, activist, thinker, and musician, and certainly his performances retain an enigmatic ethos. Yet taken as a whole and in context of the psychedelic counterculture for which Hendrix was a guiding light, I believe the political trajectory of Hendrix's performances of the Star-Spangled Banner is certain. The earliest surviving recorded example of Hendrix making a musical reference to the Star-Spangled Banner was captured by an amateur recordist on August 16, 1968, at a performance at Meriwether Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland, really only a few miles from where Francis Scott Key penned the lyric. Near the end of a set-closing rendition of Wild Thing, Hendrix plays a rising fourth and then slides into a rather slow rendition of the opening phrase of the anthem. He immediately segues into a full rendition of the Civil War bugle elegy, Taps, and then repeats the opening gesture of the anthem, followed by an extended and free improvisation that features low rising moans and other feedback. Mitch Mitchell's frenetic drums underlie the entire segment, but become especially violent during the improvisation. The audience cheers, and Hendrix's solo ends somewhat abruptly, suggesting that he may have destroyed his guitar to end the show, as he did playing the same song so famously at Monterey Pop a year earlier. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the opening interval of a fourth anticipates Taps, making his quotation a musical hybrid of both bugle call and anthem, as well as a closing coda to Wild Thing. What I mean by the notion of a fourth, so this is an interval, so any two musical pitches basically have an an interval, right? So don da don, that's a fourth, don don, so don don don, don don don, don don don, gets you taps, but it also gets you the last phrase of the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? So that oh, say and the opening of Taps are the same musical gesture in the same direction. And I think that's part of what maybe invited Hendrix to think of those two songs as connected, other than their obvious American patriotic commentary. Whether spontaneous or pre-planned, even this Hendrix's first sonic reference to the anthem contained the basic elements of the Woodstock banner to appear a year later. The anthem tune, the Taps melody, and abstract improvisations that might offer illustrations of battle and thus commentary on war. Several elements in this first rendition also imply a significance deeper than improvisatory play or pandering showmanship. By juxtaposing the anthem and Taps, the haunting and eloquent bugle call used by the American military since the U.S. Civil War as a farewell tribute to deceased comrades, Hendrix connects the anthem with death and mourning for America's soldiers, only a few months after the Tet Offensive had soured U.S. public opinion on the Vietnam War. The meaning of the taps reference, however, is potentially laden with irony, and thus depends on Hendrix's view of the military. Hendrix himself enlisted in the Army to avoid jail in May of 1961, and according to biographer Charles Cross, embraced the structure of military life. The enthusiasm of his initial letters home contradict later interviews in which Hendrix claimed to hate the military. By January of 1962, Hendrix had completed a challenging course of parachute training to earn his Screaming Eagles patch as a member of the 101st Airborne. He had requested this assignment, and when it was granted, told his father in a letter that he would, quote, try my very best to make this airborne for the sake of our name, end quote. Soon afterward, Hendrix would meet fellow soldier and bassist Billy Cox and form a band. As the guitarist's interest in music returned, and with Cox set to be released from duty, Hendrix undertook a dangerous ruse to convince Army doctors that he was a homosexual, then a cause for discharge, and thus earn early release to pursue his musical career. Nevertheless, Hendrix's respect for the military and his empathy for his former comrades seem to have remained. For example, his colorful vintage chic costuming not only turned heads, but spoke to his admiration of military life. From London stores, he purchased 2 British military jackets, an 18th century elaborately styled Royal Hussar jacket, and a 19th century Royal Army Veterinary Corps dress jacket. Although markers of psychedelic culture and an image-making vehicle of his own superstar persona and its commercial success, these jackets also fascinated Hendrix as military artifacts. In August 1968, when Hendrix first quotes the banner melody, his former unit, in fact the entire 101st Airborne, had been deployed to Vietnam. It's conceivable then that his invocation of taps that day in Maryland might have been a sincere tribute to his friends and maybe more generally to the many soldiers who had lost their lives in Vietnam. Musical evidence connotes this sincerity. Hendrix uses the same basic slow tempo for both anthem and elegy, suggesting that they make a single statement. Also curious is the fact that whereas the Star-Spangled Banner quotation is here incomplete and even includes a wrong note, the taps melody is rendered correctly and in full. The anthem is fragmented, the bugle call complete. Thus, this first Columbia banner can be heard as a kind of eulogy for fallen comrades, as a wrapping of a tattered flag around the anguish of mourning, punctuated by illustrations of war. Hendrix's few direct comments about the Vietnam War seem to undercut further the possibility of anti-war critique in Hendrix's early banner performances and suggest an attitude of support for the U.S. military. Asked about Vietnam while living in England in late 1966 or early 67, Hendrix remarked, quote, after China takes over the whole world, then the whole world will know why America is trying so hard in Vietnam. Not long afterwards, Hendrix told an interviewer from the Dutch magazine Kink, quote, did you send the Americans away when they landed in Normandy? The Americans are fighting in Vietnam for a completely free world. Of course, war is horrible, but at present it's still the only guarantee of peace, end quote. This reference to Normandy here and thus to D-Day might even suggest that Hendrix retained some residual pride in the achievements of the 101st Airborne. And I'm realizing here that I forgot to play the quote. So let's hear that so you can at least get a little sense. So this is an outro for Wild Things I Said, ends the concert, relatively short, at least compared to what he would do at Woodstock later. Hendrix had, in fact, struck this chord already. About 2 weeks before this first recorded reference to the anthem, Hendrix performed in Dallas, Texas. In his stage banter that evening, he dedicated his autobiographical song, I Don't Live for Today, to, quote, all the soldiers fighting in D.C., Detroit, and oh yes, all the soldiers in Vietnam. At this same concert, Hendrix ends a performance of Purple Haze with a complete rendition of Taps, to which the audience claps its approval. This earlier performance of Taps is intriguing, as it suggests that the first Columbia banner may not be a rendition of the U.S. national anthem at all. Instead, it can be heard as a performance of Taps, illustrated by quotes of the anthem, rather than the other way around. Hendrix's musical engagement with the national anthem proceeded rapidly. On September 4th, 1968, he performed the melody for the third time and in nearly complete form as part of a 5-minute abstract improvisation at Memorial Coliseum in Phoenix, Arizona. The fidelity of this audience tape is exceptionally clear, and thus the contribution of drummer Mitch Mitchell is confirmed. Often thought of as a solo guitar statement, Hendrix's banners were typically duets with Mitchell, and particularly good recordings even reveal the participation of bassist Noel Redding. In this particular Phoenix performance, the anthem opening is loud, eerie, and atmospheric, fading to Hendrix alone and soon featuring some of the musical cries, moans, pealing sirens, and percussive explosions that would be heard at Woodstock. The improvisation grows increasingly violent, and just over 3 minutes in, Hendrix begins the anthem melody. Mitchell maintains a continuous stream of noise, using cymbals, toms, snare, and probably bass drum, apparently everything at his disposal with nearly unrelenting athleticism. Hendrix inserts pictorialisms into the melody at the words rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air, depicting the rockets and bombs of Key's text within his sonic illusions. Although Hendrix and Mitchell had evoked such images from their 2 previous banner renditions, this appears to be the first instance of these gestures being placed at specifically illustrative points, responding to Francis Scott Key's lyric. Shorter than they would be at Woodstock, these gestures nevertheless reveal that the explosive imagery of Woodstock and almost every banner to follow had both been created and assigned a particular place more than 11 months earlier. Hendrix's anthem arrangement increasingly shows evidence of such compositional thinking. In Phoenix, Hendrix maintains the moaning figures from the Merriweather performance, but also introduces new elements that would survive in the Woodstock version. These include a heavy, pulsing tremolo strumming of the second-to-last questioning phrase, "Oh, say, does that star-spangled yet wave?" possibly suggesting a flag waving in the breeze, as well as a long, shaking extension in the final phrase that highlights the word free. The sensitivity to text, now evident in the increasingly detailed arrangement, also becomes characteristic of future versions. In effect, Hendrix is not playing an instrumental at all. Rather, he sings the song with his guitar, such that the lyric, words well known to his listeners, are present in each of his instrumental utterances. This detailed awareness of the anthem text connects with a long tradition of blues-based storytelling, the talking blues, and draws on the examples of Hendrix's musical models, such as Howlin' Wolf's Moaning at Midnight and How Many More Years. An audience recording made 5 days later, on September 9, 1968, in Portland, Oregon, preserves Hendrix's first known spoken introduction to the banner, a feature that comes in and out of his performance practice, as well as recorded documentation. Here he states simply, quote, "We're going to do this thing, go something like Purple Haze," end quote. He then performs Key's anthem. Hendrix thus formalizes the connection between anthem and Purple Haze that began at the Singer Bowl on August 23rd, and will continue to Woodstock and beyond. Approximately 2/3 of his recorded performances treat the anthem as a prelude to Purple Haze. This connection carries intent, as Hendrix will equate Purple Haze with a new national anthem. Stage banter offers an important and underutilized tool in understanding Hendrix's art. Speaking directly to his listeners, Hendrix entertains and engages, but also explains. The Portland banner's heightened emotional intensity continued through Hendrix's next 5 anthem performances, one in Los Angeles, and one what I consider to be 4 pivotal renditions at San Francisco's Winterland Ballroom. These can be heard as further critical reworkings of the anthem arrangement as a tone poem, or more accurately, as a tone portrait. Each involves some sort of spoken introduction, stretches of free improvisation, and in 2 cases, the use of additional quotations. Since the Phoenix performance, Hendrix's intervening renditions have lasted at least 5 minutes, with the second and third Winterland banners of October 10th and 11th stretching to nearly 6.5 minutes, the longest performances of the anthem by Hendrix among the recordings I have located. Just prior to Winterland, Hendrix performs the anthem at the Hollywood Bowl on September 14th, offering a slightly truncated version lasting only a bit over 3 minutes. He begins this performance with a percussive strumming figure and then asks the crowd a question. This is America, right? He thus suggests, maybe too obliquely, that his anthem offers a signal portrait of the country. This idea of a sounding national portrait comes to fruition with the Winterland banners. Here, Hendrix would become even more direct in his introductions, labeling these performances with an independent title, This is America. At the second Winterland show in particular, Hendrix's stage banter offers interpretive insights. His spoken introduction is unusually long, more than a bit rambling, but is also pretty revealing.
Well, they continue on with a thing called This is America, representing the sounds and the feedback what you hear. It's really lost souls and frustration, it seems like to me. I don't know, the weirdest messengers, you know. And like, we'll see if we can get this thing across to maybe through all this racket that some people think we're working up there. All the way racket, no. It's a thing, you know. You get tired of playing notes sometimes, so you really want to play, or get close to playing exactly what you call a true feeling, regardless of its, or, or it's one of those, those kinds of, hey, hold on. Right. Yeah, very simple in the sun, but I couldn't. And it begins off, that's the you hear the hang-up side, which will probably be lasting about 3 or 2 minutes, and then you hear our side of it, which we'd like to say thank you very much, Owsley.
So rather than the Star-Spangled Banner, Hendrix has titled his reconception of Key's song, This is America, and thinks of it as a kind of sonic portrait of true feelings that go beyond the cliched discourse of popular culture. He also hints at the reason for pairing the banner with Purple Haze, in that the anthem represents the hang-up side, whereas his song offers an alternative, our side, by which he seems to mean an identity celebrating psychedelic culture. The Winterland banners explore a pre-composed set of possibilities within an overall form that had been developed since his Phoenix performance in the previous month. That form is made up of 2 parts. First, a free improvisatory prelude, and then the banner melody. Although the first performance in Winterland starts off and remains loud, the other 3 begin softly with atmospheric pitch slides and Mitchell's cymbal work. Evoking Ornette Coleman's free jazz aesthetic, each dystopian prelude reaches a violent climax featuring sonic rhetoric of explosions, bombs, and gunfire that has become characteristic of the arrangement and will, of course, appear at Woodstock. And we just play, this is like just an excerpt from the 3rd Winterland banner. And it just sort of gives you the climax of this dystopian prelude that is really where the added time in the arrangement comes. So he spends 3-4 minutes doing this. Hendrix also experiments with additional quotations, not only taps, but the TV themes to Bonanza, the Mickey Mouse Club, and the Gillette Cavalcade of Sports. 60s countercultural figure John Sinclair has associated Hendrix quotes with a critique of commercial culture, and indeed they can be heard as mocking capitalist marketing constructs and the controls from which radicals would drop out, such as the military draft, consumerism, and racial segregation. For his fans, certainly, Hendrix symbolized the revolutions of sex, drugs, justice, thought, race, and youth, notions anathema to the whitewashed images of rugged Western manhood and childhood innocence celebrated by the Cartwright family in Bonanza and the wholesome middlebrow Musketeers. Not sure Mickey would have done great in Vietnam, actually. In January and February of 1969, the Experience toured Northern and Central Europe, playing 26 shows in 16 venues. Hendrix offered his banner 7 times and made his first solo recording of the anthem at London's Olympic Sound Studios. Although such performances of the anthem outside the United States certainly signaled Hendrix's own U.S. citizenship, they also presented a critical view of the nation. Insulated from any homeland pressures to be patriotic, Hendrix openly criticized the war from his position center stage. In his banter, he dedicated shows in Stockholm to the American Deserters Society and later the American Deserters Organization. Presumably, his European audiences might have included a few young men, Americans living abroad to escape the draft. Sonic references to U.S. race riots from within his banner improvisations are muted in Europe, and Hendrix's concert dedications reference only the war in Vietnam, not the wars in Detroit and Washington, D.C. from his previous dedications. Recording in New York at the record plant on March 18, 1969, Hendrix's only other studio version of the anthem offers further evidence of his artistic engagement with the melody. Tempted by new multi-track equipment, Hendrix indulges his interest in studio experiments to create a unique sonic fireworks display. That night, Hendrix recorded alone with engineer Tony Bongiovi using the studio's new Ampex 16-track machine to create a 4-minute solo anthem. It was the first time in his recording career that Hendrix had had access to so many tracks, and he quickly filled them with overdubs of himself playing the anthem melody, using studio tricks to broaden his sonic palette. This version moves through a plain statement of the melody. Absent are Hendrix's pyrotechnic feedback stream illustrations of rockets and bombs. A pause before phrase 4 allows for the highest guitar to play what may be fleeting altissimo allusions to the bugle calls for charge, as well as taps. Hendrix extends the final cadence for more than 2 minutes, featuring cascades of strumming strings, slides, trills, rhythmic riffs, and bell-like melodies. Throughout this extension, the energy of the song slowly dissipates, disarming any sense of protest. Here, Hendrix foreshadows a vein of patriotic affirmation in his musical conception that would become clear at Woodstock. This record banner is also one of Hendrix's few non-Woodstock anthem arrangements to be commercially released, and thus relatively well known. After Hendrix's death, this version became part of the soundtrack to the New Age film Rainbow Bridge, and thus part of its soundtrack album. In the interest of time, we'll jump to the main event here and focus on the Woodstock anthem of August 18, 1969. At Woodstock, Hendrix's banner appeared in its by now standard pairing with Purple Haze, as the 13th and 14th numbers of an extended 16-song set. Remarkably, Hendrix had already introduced his regular closing song, Voodoo Child, as, quote, the new American anthem until we get another one together, end quote. Hendrix clearly intended to close an already long set, saying, thank you very much and good night. It was good morning, but anyway. Thank you very much and good night. I'd like to say peace, yeah, and happiness. Yet, Voodoo Child develops into an extended free jam closing with a talking guitar solo and a crowd-pleasing dental coda. He offers no spoken introduction to the banner, but next begins the anthem melody in his usual key of E-flat major, performed in E, but with his guitar tuned down a half step. This key would be all but impossible for group singing, so it is no surprise that neither he nor the audience sings along. Hendrix plays the opening phrase, "Oh say can you see," and then holds up a 2-finger peace sign to the audience. The crowd screams in response and claps its approval. He then delivers the first 2 phrases of this anthem simply. The tempo is even, each note is clear and at full volume. Feedback is used but does not distort, and melodic ornaments are restrained. Hendrix offers no foreshadowing of the violent sounds to come and stands straight and motionless, if anything seemingly disengaged. Mitchell supports the power of Hendrix's initial phrases with active rolls, hits, and cymbal work, and the film reveals that Juma Sultan adds a shimmering tambourine and drum strikes, although these are inaudible in the audio mix. The rest of Hendrix's band, Billy Cox on bass, Larry Lee on rhythm guitar, Jerry Velas on congas, lay out entirely. As a result, the performance is effectively a duo by Hendrix and Mitchell, as was typical during concerts by The Experience over the previous year. Hendrix retains his pictorial sensitivity to Key's lyric. Immediately after sounding the melodic phrase that would give voice to the words, "and the rocket's red glare," Hendrix swoops upward, offering a blistering representation of war with crunching explosions, repeated strumming for gunfire, and screams, all supported by Mitchell's ecstatic drumming. The Woodstock documentary film makes these sounds particularly dramatic, closing in on Hendrix's face as he mouths his guitar's cries and wails, and thus humanizes the sounds of suffering in his stage choreography. Mitchell drops out and Hendrix cuts the effects for the next melodic motif, but after the text bombs bursting in air, he again presents violent musical imagery, now closer to the sounds of rioting, beginning with a tritone siren, and then whammy bar bends. Mitchell re-enters on cymbals and then snare, falling bombs and cries follow, and Hendrix again offers just the tune while Mitchell drops out. Next, Hendrix presents a high, altissimo version of taps, playing only the first half of the melody, before returning to the opening chorus that begins the last phrase of the anthem, that "Oh, say does that star." A shared gesture, first showcased, as I talked about, in Hendrix's original Columbia performance a year earlier. The interpolation of taps may similarly call out to friends and his 101st Airborne comrades serving in Vietnam, and echoes his invocation of soldiers at Woodstock earlier that same morning when he introduced the song Isabella by saying, quote, "I'd like to do a song dedicated to maybe a soldier in the army, sing about his old lady that he dreams about, and he has that machine gun instead," end quote. Remarkably, Hendrix had not used the taps quote, so critical to the Woodstock banner's effect, as part of any of his banner performances since the Winterland sessions over 10 months earlier. So there's probably 15, or at least a dozen, that he has done in between those two, and he hasn't used taps until now. For the final phrase of the anthem, Hendrix switches on his wah-wah effects pedal to achieve a pulsating 16th note triplet repeat used since at least the LA Forum concert that year in April. At the end of the next gesture, he pauses on what would be the word wave, switches off the wah and uses the whammy bar even more deeply to depict the fluttering flag as he now allows the sound to feed back. After a breath of silence, Hendrix completes the final gesture, holding on to the word free, before rounding off the whole with a strong, rising cadence to segue without break into Purple Haze. So since we've talked about it, I think we should experience it. Not that y'all haven't seen it thousands of times like I have, but it's always worth it. Still awesome. Jason and I were talking earlier about the way you explain things in rock history. It's like, it's awesome. And that certainly fits. Usually you say it's something awesome, but I'm not going to say that on live stream. The Woodstock banner presents a concise and powerful reconfiguration of several anthem devices that Hendrix had been working on over the past year, especially sonic imagery of violence and the waving of the flag itself, as well as the quotation of taps. Certainly this evocation of violence and death, both at home and abroad, offered a stunning reminder that the United States had serious problems to resolve. However, in assessing the Woodstock banner and its clear message of critique, it is just as important to catalog the established devices that Hendrix does not use. At Woodstock, Hendrix does not use a slow tempo, rubato, or other rhythmic distortions. There is neither strategic misintonation nor inadvertent turning problems. And that's actually the fun thing about watching the video, is that you see that Hendrix he tunes like 4 times during the performance. Right? It's really important to him that he get this right. I mean, Hendrix was obsessed with tuning anyway, but he's particularly obsessed with getting the anthem right. The melody is full and strong throughout and is presented in its entirety without a single pitch error and with only limited ornamentation. He avoids quoting TV themes and other pop cultural references. He eschews crowd-pleasing body tricks, never striking the strings with his teeth. He stands still, almost reverently, except while performing the dramatic battle imagery or stepping forward to switch his effects pedals. Finally, the banner melody begins and ends the performance, and there is a strong cadence to round off the song as an autonomous statement. Thus, Hendrix's Woodstock banner is in no way a sonic deconstruction of the anthem. Instead, it carries many patriotic trappings, and with the albeit critical exceptions of its psychedelic pictorialisms, the interpolation of taps, and the simple fact that it sounds on a guitar at all, the Woodstock banner is surprisingly close in many respects to a more traditional anthem rendition. If Hendrix had wished to metaphorically burn the tune or insult the nation musically, he had much more effective sonic means at his disposal. At one Winterland performance, for example, he began the anthem with a slow-burning improvisatory battle, inserted TV-themed quotations, truncated the anthem melody, and closed with the taps quotation, leaving his listener on the battlefield and in mourning. Other performances, such as those at Phoenix and Portland in 1968, offered incomplete fragments of the tune with wrong notes and ironic misintonation. He would often, if he was angry about something, like, I cut it for time, but I'll just talk about it now. The LA Forum banner performance is one of the most interesting, and that's actually the one that Pete Johnson is complaining about when he says it's meaningless sensationalism. But in that case, you know, these big rock concerts, then the crowds Hendrix was attracting were not common at the time, and so the security, staff for various events really didn't know how to handle the crowds. And so there was this, at the LA Forum, basically the rent-a-cops, as he called them, were beating up his fans right in front of him. And so he does this really ironic performance of the anthem where he completely changes the order. And then when he plays, so he plays the fourth phrase before he plays the second phrase, but he particularly mistunes the word free. So it goes, you know, so I think to sort of emphasize that this is not an example of a free country, what was happening right in front of him. So if he had wanted to do something really insulting, he knew how to do it. Let's see. As he explained, so at Woodstock, rather, Hendrix's anthem eloquently summarizes the perspective he gained on America from his travels abroad. As he explained to Circus Magazine, quote, "I still love America, quite naturally, but I can see why people put it down. It has so much good in it, you know, but it has so much evil, too," unquote. Yet the Woodstock rendition also reflects the guitarist's positive experience at the festival, one that seems to have restored his sense of optimism for the nation. His peace sign gesture raised in answer to the lyric's opening question, "Oh, say, can you see?" to start this performance offers support for this more optimistic interpretation. Let me see here. Woodstock marks a turning point for Hendrix, his band, and his art. In many ways, the Woodstock anthem signals a pinnacle of his banner eloquence. Certainly it deserves its fame and its artistic reputation. Yet Woodstock also changed Hendrix's banner. The notoriety of the performance, and especially its function as the climax of the Woodstock documentary film, impacted the way that future audiences experienced Hendrix's banner performances, as well as the way he performed them. On April 25th, 1970, back at the Forum in Los Angeles for the kickoff concert of the Cry of Love tour, and now performing in a trio with Mitchell and Cox, Hendrix again presents the banner as he did for at least 19 of the 32 concerts of this final tour. His arrangement has calcified around the Woodstock structure. He presents the entire anthem melody, always featuring the pictorial departures on glare and air, the flag-waving use of the wah-wah pedal and tremolo bar, plus the full rising cadence leading into Purple Haze. His performance is reminiscent of Woodstock, but the audience response has changed. The release of the Woodstock documentary film on March 26th, about a month earlier, seems to have influenced audience expectations. During the first year of Hendrix's banner renditions, his audience was largely unresponsive to the anthem's opening pitches. During the 1970 Cry of Love tour, however, cheers greet these opening notes, and sometimes continue for most of the piece. Musically, his battle pictorialisms sustain their intensity, but Hendrix adds increasing amounts of Baroque-inspired ornamentation to the melody, so like little decorative notes, neighbors, tones, trills, things like that. These decorative appliques highlight Hendrix's facile virtuosity, but also diminish the stark power of his Woodstock rendition. The Cry of Love banners as a whole, thus, seem burdened by the film and too soon banished to nostalgia. However, Hendrix revitalized his anti-war rhetoric by shifting his message to a new composition, Machine Gun. Hendrix performed this tune 15 times on the 1970 tour and only played it twice in San Antonio and San Bernardino. And we could have a whole conversation about the banner in Texas, because that's another story, but only played it twice without the banner. His two concerts at the Berkeley Community Theater on May 30th, each of which included both pieces, demonstrate how Hendrix's setlist and stage banter worked in combination throughout much of this tour to send an anti-war message. What was a single song that called attention to the violence of war is now just part of an entire set of songs that convey a more powerful and irrefutable critical patriotism. While the Woodstock film threatened to turn the Hendrix banner into a cliché, by shifting it to a position within an anti-war set, Hendrix enabled its mixture of patriotism, critique, and affirmation of hope to recapture some of its latent political power. Apparently inspired by the centrality of Berkeley to anti-war protest, Hendrix made the political resonance in his music particularly explicit in his stage banter at these concerts. His message of protest was nothing new to his audience. What was remarkable is that Hendrix turns the tables on this audience, seeming to criticize his post-Woodstock, post-Kent State, post-People's Park listeners. Hendrix dedicated the first Berkeley concert to all the cats that have died for a cause that is going to happen anyway, and kicked off with the song Fire. Next, he offered Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good, pandering to the crowd by playing part of the solo with his teeth, followed by Hear My Train A-Comin' and Foxy Lady. Hendrix next introduced Machine Gun, saying, quote, "But still we got dedications to all the soldiers that are fighting, in Chicago that are in jail, all the soldiers in New York, Florida, right here in Berkeley, especially the soldiers in Berkeley. Oh yes, the soldiers in Vietnam too. To all of them is dedicated a thing called Machine Gun." The lyrics of Machine Gun suggest that enemies are all part of the same human family, in lines such as "Evil man make me kill ya, evil man make you kill me." Beginning to draw the concert to a close, Hendrix thanks the audience for coming and then tells everyone to stand. Quote, "We'd like everybody to stand up. Everybody stand up on your seats. We're going to play the American anthem the way it really is." Hendrix had begun regularly asking his audience to stand for the anthem back at the LA Forum to open the tour, saying, quote, "Stand up, man, for once in your life," end quote. This call signifies on the traditional reverence accorded to the national anthem, in which citizens stand, place their hands over their hearts, and sing along. However, one didn't sing along to Hendrix's banners. Rather, the call to stand up for once in your life seems to be a call to action and may serve as an implicit critique of the passivity of some of these fans. Before the 1970 tour, Hendrix had never asked his audience to stand for his performances of the U.S. anthem. Yet repeated for nearly every banner rendition that summer, this call to action may have expressed Hendrix's frustration that the potential of Woodstock was not being realized. He urged his audience to action. In Berkeley, such provocation was hardly necessary, but as his show drew to a close, it nevertheless served to shift the focus of his audience from artistry to action. He repeated a similar call for the second Berkeley show later that same night. To introduce the final number, Voodoo Child, Hendrix summarized his political concerns, quote, "We're all in this mess together. We're all living, trying to grow, little children, taking steps here and there from home. And some have big dreams, and some of those get killed by all this bullshit. Old traditional schemes. So that's why we have to keep our asses together. We got a thing called Voodoo Child. It's a new American anthem." The trajectory of these concerts, a template that was standard for the Cry of Love tour, suggests that the complexities of Hendrix's banners, which offer both a critique of race relations and of the war in Vietnam, were balanced by an optimistic view of America's potential for change. Showcased at Woodstock, this combination of hope and critique has expanded for the Cry of Love tour performances to embrace the design of the entire second half of his show. Machine Gun through the Star-Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child were offered together as an anti-war suite and call to psychedelic citizenship. That Voodoo Child was to be a new American anthem suggests that his vision for the future was more evolutionary than revolutionary, and that it was rooted in the land of his birth, not some interstellar alternative. Instead of Key's lyric, however, Hendrix offered an alternative identity, a politics rooted not in a flag as symbol of fortitude, but in music as psychedelic consciousness. Jimi Hendrix's performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at the Woodstock Music and Art Fair is an iconic moment in U.S. history, at its most mythical countercultural happening, and thus succinctly expresses the transformational dreams of the 1960s. Hendrix's Woodstock banner has been ingrained in U.S. cultural memory, yet its very status as legend distorts its legacy and opens the performance to interpretations at odds with a detailed examination of Hendrix's engagement with the song. In more than 60 performances over 25 months, Jimi Hendrix used the national anthem, its melody, and its symbolic resonance as a tool to explore not only his personal identity, but to take stock of a nation in often violent transition and to make this process audible to his listeners, as critique, as affirmation, and as call to activism. To refer to Hendrix's performances of the anthem at Woodstock, or Hendrix's performance of the anthem at Woodstock, as a singular event is to remix the guitarist's more textured musical message. The Hendrix banner is a plural construction, a multi-site process. In this sense, the Hendrix banners are not songs or even anthems at all, but a practice of citizenship in which an artist struggles with tradition to communicate and inspire. We might consider Hendrix as an example of the countercultural citizen, the psychedelic citizen, one who struggles with the nation's problems and one who embraces its possibilities through music as civic participation. Thanks. So thanks very much. I just have to show off this picture because Andy gave that to me. So this is from the Henry Diltz collection upstairs, which just has an incredible set of gorgeous photographs. And this picture, this really doesn't do it justice on the screen, but just absolutely beautiful colors and resolution. So and you can see the autograph down there at the bottom. So that's up in the storage here at the archives. So thanks very much for sharing that with me.
We have time for some questions, so if there are any, I'll bring the mic around and we'll get you on the stream. Right here.
I just wanted to ask how you got interested in sort of researching all this about the Jimi Hendrix Star-Spangled Banners.
That's a great question. Well, initially it came from presenting this video to my students as a way of getting them to think a little bit more deeply about song and sound and rock and really all music as something that wasn't just sort of a distraction or a transcendent experience or entertainment, but was really something that actually shaped the way they thought about the world and the way they thought about themselves. And so I just started playing it, and some of the initial observations about the way in which the sound matches up with the words were basically the story I would give. And then I just wanted to know more, I think, about where this came from, and I started looking at releases, and a handful, especially after Hendrix died so young, a lot of his back catalog and bootlegs were released, and now they're being curated rather beautifully by the Hendrix family. But for a while it was a little bit catch us, catch can, but that LA Fun performance, for instance, was released as a live album, and a few things trickled out. So I think the next thing I heard was the Rainbow Bridge soundtrack, and I was sort of like, what? I thought it was this protest song, and it didn't make sense to me that he would play it as this kind of celebration of America when I thought he was in such a sort of angular and oppositional relationship to the country. And so I just started, actually the big breakthrough was when I discovered this thing called the internet. And there's a Usenet group on Yahoo and called Jimmy Pass It On, JPIO, which was a trading site for fans that were basically all of these sort of high capacity DVDs of FLAC files are traded. And the first thing I did was I discovered this, was all excited, and I sent them this message. Hi, I'm a scholar from the University of Michigan, and I'm doing this thing. Can someone tell me what the Star-Spangled Banner is all about? And it's like, silence. Like I had just clearly broken some rule. They thought I was like an FBI agent trying to bust up the ring. I don't know what, but I clearly had done something. So then actually I commissioned one of my students to be my avatar and to go back in without being an idiot like I had been, and to just basically start gathering these discs, and that probably got me my first dozen or so alternate takes. And then it was really that I became an obsession to try to get out. The Rock Hall actually helped me. Stephanie Harrell, as I said, helped me in two ways. One is was coming up with the Dallas performance. So the thing that happened in Texas is that at least in one of these cases, Hendrix was actually threatened before the concert. Like, you do not play this, by some of the people who greeted him at the door. You don't play the Star-Spangled Banner like that in Texas. And this is pre-Woodstock. This is like, I think, March of '68, no, it'd be 69. But in any event, he played it anyway. But he played it and then got immediately off the stage and went home. It was the one time he did the Star-Spangled Banner as the last piece on the set. So, and he sort of tests the water earlier in the concert. He plays like just the opening melody as part of an improvisation. And since there's no riot, I guess he figures it's safe to do later. But there's just, I think what I've really discovered by exploring all these different versions is that he, rather than being kind of sort of a tripped out fantasy trip, it's really something that's responding to what's going on around him. And so he puts in his introduction, and then also in the way he plays it, a way of reflecting contemporary life that's in the papers like that day or that week. It's not just about, it's also about, but it's not just about this larger statement about American identity. It's also a very specific response. So I think like at Berkeley, there's a very specific response, because he knows he has with the activist leaders of the entire nation in the hall with him, right? And so he's going to say, stand up, we got to do something. You don't realize I've been going around, it's not happening like you think it is. We got to try harder. I think is part of that message. But you basically, the thing about Hendrix is probably everyone in here would agree, you get in and you can't get out, basically. You're stuck. Yeah, Mandy.
Thanks for that talk, Mark. That was great. You kind of started talking about Machine Gun a little bit at the end, and how it's kind of part of this, I think you called it something like an anti-war suite or something like that. And I feel like these two songs, though, have a closer musical connection than the other songs in the suite, not only because of the oral evocation of guns and warfare, but also the bodily response to that warfare and the crying, right? So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the complementary affects of those tunes, how, Machine Gun is maybe a little more mournful or angry or less optimistic than the anthem, and if you can kind of talk about the relationship in the live trajectory of Hendrix a little bit.
Right. That's an insightful comment. I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a relationship between two. I mean, in the way they're composed, obviously if we see it as sort of 4 songs, and sometimes there were a couple other songs. He had a song he called Freedom, they would put in there sometimes. But Machine Gun to the Star-Spangled Banner to Purple Haze to Voodoo Child was the typical sort of, I would say, support poles of that second half of those concerts on the Cry of Love tour. So both Purple Haze and Voodoo Child predate him playing the Star-Spangled Banner by quite a bit. And then Machine Gun is something he writes not long after, right after Woodstock, right? So, and what's interesting is his premiere of that piece, at least as far as I understand it, is actually on the Dick Cavett show. He plays an early version of it. So he goes on Dick Cavett, and those Dick Cavett tapes are really worth watching, in part because I don't know if Dick Cavett was a musician. He interviewed a lot of musicians, but he really takes Hendrix seriously. I mean, he doesn't treat Hendrix like he's some kind of clown or, some kind of person, because probably most people in Cavett's audience thought he was a freak. But Cavett really wants to bring out his artistry and really to treat him as an artist. And so some of the longer quotes I have about Hendrix talking about sort of the way music could mean really come from that interview with Cavett, because he takes him so seriously. And among the things he's talking about is the Star-Spangled Banner, which is the reason I watched it. Because if it doesn't do the Star-Spangled Banner, I don't know about it. But I'm kidding. But he asks Hendrix, famously, what were you up to at Woodstock? And and then he turns to his audience and says, don't send your nasty letters. And Hendrix says, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, if you do the anthem in an unorthodox way, people will complain. And he says, well, what do you mean? It wasn't unorthodox. It was beautiful. And he also writes a poem called 100,000 Halos, which is about Woodstock, which is very positive. So that's, I think, where some of that positive resonance comes from. And so I think it's interesting to go to your question, that he does the darker Machine Gun, and then he sort of restores that breath of possibility, that breath of hope, by going to the Star-Spangled Banner, and then gives his alternative, well, which is Purple Haze, which he introduces right after Woodstock at the UAB block party in Harlem as the African-American national anthem. Right? So, and then by the time we get to Berkeley, he's really calling Voodoo Child the new American anthem. So I think there is very much a development of Hendrix's thinking as a sort of citizen, I guess, coming out of the military, actually feeling pretty strong about the need for the military in Asia to fight communism, and then sort of turning after his journey to England, and then touring in Germany and in Europe. I think that's a really important move for him conceptually, because I think that's where he gains the perspective that allows him to see the United States from the outside. And playing the anthem there, as I mentioned, I think means something different. But the very first time he uses the word anthem at all in any of his stage banter is at Monterey Pop, right after he comes back from England. And that's where he talks about Wild Thing as the British and American anthems put together. So I think this interest in trying to figure out who he is and how that relates to it is sort of coming up at that moment. And so, and Voodoo Child and Purple Haze are part of his repertoire at that point. And then it's the Star-Spangled Banner that becomes the place where he's figuring that out. He does Woodstock, and then Woodstock sort of freezes the anthem arrangement, and then he moves that working out to Machine Gun. Right? And so as it's moving, it's getting increasingly sort of activist, increasingly angry. The protest aspect is coming out. But I do think that glimmer of hope is really what Woodstock holds to. And then my reading of it is that the Cry of Love tour is this complaint, basically, that we did all this stuff and I'm still here and I'm still playing the same song in the same way. And this has got to change. Yeah, great question.
How widely viewed was the video from Woodstock? Because we didn't have YouTube back then. So how did that affect the perception back then? Is that moment frozen in time? And then you also talked about the venues where he played, but Woodstock didn't. Terry told me that my buddy here, who's the expert, said he played first thing in the morning, so everybody was probably hungover and wasted on whatever they were doing. So how that affected his version that time too?
Good questions. I haven't really been able to figure out how quickly the Woodstock film took over. Maybe some of you experienced that and can speak to that, and I'd be happy to hear what you have to say. It is on a local release, then a national release, and then the Woodstock soundtrack comes out, which I think amplifies the film even further. So the real evidence I have that it did something is the fact that the audience tapes record this weird reaction, right? Which is that before Woodstock, nobody claps or screams or gets excited at all when he starts playing the anthem. And you heard the very first Columbia banner, and the audience tape, right? The person taping is actually talking to the person next to them while the anthem is playing, right? He's not going, oh my gosh, he's playing the anthem. He's just going, what are you doing tonight? What are you doing? So that was not a particular moment where they galvanized the attention of the crowd. Whereas when you go to LA Forum 4 with the Cry of Love tour, he just goes doo-da-da, and then the crowd erupts. Right, so clearly there's been a difference in the way that the audience responds, and I really think, the way I know the anthem so well is through the film and the soundtrack, and I really think that's many more people did it that way. And the other evidence for that is that, as you pointed out, he doesn't play. Hendrix is supposed to close the festival on Sunday night. The thing gets famously far behind, all sorts of problems because of the mass of humanity that showed up. Rainy, muddy, horrible conditions, not a lot of food, lots of reasons to go home early. So of the hundreds of thousands of people who attended the festival, if you look at Gail Marcus's review in the Rolling Stone magazine, which I looked at yesterday, and we were there, it was pretty cool to hold the original one, not just a scan of it. But he gets to the Hendrix set in the last paragraph, and he says maybe 30,000 people are left. Right, so it's a very small crowd, and Hendrix plays, it's often said, I think because of this mythic status of the anthem, it's often said that as the sun was rising, Hendrix plays the opening notes of the anthem. Not possible, right? Hendrix starts at 8:30, it's a 2-hour set, he plays the Star-Spangled Banner towards the end. Sunrise may have had to have been extremely delayed that morning if it was going to happen during the anthem. So I think it's really the legend of Woodstock and the legend of this, sort of propelled by the film and then really galvanized by Hendrix's death, right? So since Hendrix dies basically a year later on really the 13-month anniversary of the festival, it's that's part of what leads to all this hagiographic writing and all this celebration of what he had done. And what's interesting to me actually in terms of the banner's notoriety is that one of the reasons I've been able to trace, I think, successfully the banner just in concert reviews for which we don't have audience recordings is that whenever he plays it, it gets included in the review. Like at Woodstock, they usually mention 3 songs. He did Hey Joe, he did Purple Haze, and he did the Star-Spangled Banner. But they always mention, if he even plays even the Singer Bowl Banner, which is really short, it just plays say, can you see? That's all it does. The review sort of says, and he played this raw note version of the national anthem. Right, even if it's just if somehow that it started to speak to people, early. And I think the fans already knew, and Woodstock just became the moment. So it may have just been that, 68, 69, he does a tour. In 1970, he goes back to a lot of those same places. So those audiences have heard the anthem before too. So they wouldn't have had to get it from the film. But the film and the film soundtrack, I think, are the things that give it its national scope. The other thing I've been curious about is, like, when did people get upset? Like, was there a controversy over Hendrix's anthem? It wasn't a controversy with the fans, because Woodstock was, like the 33rd performance. It was not a stunning new thing for his fans. And it actually wasn't even included in that many reviews, because the filing deadline for most newspapers, like the New York Times review, was filed Sunday night. So Hendrix isn't even in the review of the New York Times. He hasn't played yet. So it's not until you get like Rolling Stone or the more insider magazines that do the full sort of review articles a week or a month later that you get the Star-Spangled Banner mentioned at all. And then the Dick Cavett Show is the other place where it gets sort of nationally mentioned. But there's no like explosive controversy like you would have today, right? If at the Super Bowl, Beyonce did it in any way that anybody could object to, possibly, in any way, it would just be all over. And my feeling about that actually is that I think the NFL likes that. Like, I think they set up a singer, give them the microphone, so sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and sort of hoping that they'll do something that will get that much more commercial potential out of the Super Bowl, will create a maelstrom that'll get everybody talking about it. If they wanted them to sing it right, they would do like they did for Whitney Houston. They'd put a full symphony orchestra, would have lots of rehearsal, would have a conductor. They would, when you give a pop singer a microphone and nothing to hold on to in this bizarre acoustic environment, something weird's going to happen, right? So I think a lot of the controversy today is sort of engineered. But curiously enough, as far as I can tell at Woodstock, there was no huge controversy because it sort of happened in a vacuum. It happened the day after the festival had ended.
We have time for 2 more questions. One more?
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the Dick Cavett Show. Is this one of the commercial DVD releases of the Dick Cavett?
Yeah, the Hendrix Experience group has put out a DVD. Yep, exactly, and it's really worth watching. So he's on the Cavett Show. He's supposed to go on immediately after Woodstock, and he does not come to it. So they invite him back like in September 7th, I think. He's also on the Cavett Show pre-Woodstock, and really in both cases, I think offers some of his most insightful commentary, at least for mass market. I mean, another one of my theories in looking at his discussions in print and in interviews about the Star-Spangled Banner is that Hendrix may have been quite responsive to his audience. So if he's being interviewed by a rock journalist, someone who thinks is going to get it, he'll go into some detail and I think is a little bit more revealing. When he's talking to the national media, and it could be more damaging than helpful, he tends to say things like, I don't know, man, I'm American, I played it, doesn't mean anything. Right, so Cavett is like the one time in a real national forum where I think Cavett's sincere interest in Hendrix as an artist gets Hendrix to be a little more direct. And one of the things he says is that basically politics is corrupt and art is going to be the truth of the future. And that our future politics will be music. So it's no surprise to me then that he turns to Machine Gun, that he turns to the Star-Spangled Banner, and I think in forums like Berkeley to sort of say this is actually where the truth resides. Sometimes it's easy to debate what that might mean, but it was clear he wanted something else.
Thank you so much for the paper. I was thinking about the difficulty of interpreting these things and the difficulty of interpreting these sort of quasi-patriotic tunes, especially when they're done by popular musicians. And I know, I'm going to ask you a question that's not about the Star-Spangled Banner, so I'm sorry about that. But I'm thinking, like, in the early 70s, like around 72, you get a lot of these sort of popular musicians doing, like, American anthems, and that are difficult to interpret. I think of, like, Ray Charles doing America the Beautiful, metal and doing it in this sort of odd way that people don't know how to deal with it, or even Elvis doing his American trilogy, which combines like Dixie and Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then is broadcast on national TV and like Aloha from Hawaii. And there's these, I guess my question is how, just on a broad level, how do you go about interpreting and finding meanings within these sort of very complicated examples of American national identity?
It's a great question. I mean, and that's, I think, part of the anxiety and part of the reason why there are so many divergent things written about Hendrix and the Star-Spangled Banner is that a lot of it really depends on intent, and we don't really know what he intended. So that's why I think that you can sort of triangulate by putting things in context of both the place of the venue and then also in context of the stage banter. And I think those things together sort of get us closer to a reliable statement on what he might have meant as far as intent would be concerned. You know, on some level, all of these, you know, figures in the Rock Hall are more personas than people, right? I mean, so what they represent and what we do with them as receivers and listeners, as fans, you know, says as much about us as it does about them. And I think one of the things I've discovered from like these controversies over the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl is it really actually tells you more about what the person making the statement than it does about what Beyonce or Whitney Houston or, you know, Marvin Gaye or even Elvis might have said. I mean, Elvis, I would presume, was pretty sincere. I mean, he would give Nixon a gun as a gift, thinking that was a great thing. And of course, he was in the Army as well, famously. So I don't see a lot of like tortured change in Elvis. But with Hendrix, I think what's interesting is that I think it is consistent if you look at the way his statements change from 66 to 70. I mean, you see a sort of a critical consciousness developing, and exactly what that was and exactly how it came to be, I'm sort of guessing at and trying to triangulate it. I'm hoping that I'm closer than most people have been able to come, mainly because I've just brought more information to bear on the question. But I don't think I've answered the question. There's still about 5 versions I have to track down, and the last thing I want to find is a completely different version. But I think it's that kind of, it's what we do as fans. It's what we do as music historians. Is we try to come up with a plausible story that makes the experience of the music we love more vivid and deeper for us. And if we can do that in ways that people, the public, not just the few people who read our stuff, but people who really know this stuff like you guys, find satisfying or find enriching, then there's something there. But I can't claim to have the final word. So maybe in 10 years I'll come back to the same talk again and we'll see what else we got. Last question?
Thank you for this great talk, really stimulating. I was going to throw on there, I mean, certainly some of the ambiguity you're seeing is complicated by race.
Right.
And I'm thinking when you talked about that, when you hear soul music about Vietnam, you get protest, but you also you get songs that are much more from the point of view of a veteran or a veteran's family, and the kind of complexities about what is patriotism under that, patriotism and protest. So I think there's some echo there. But I wonder, the other thing, and see if you have any thoughts on this, it's interesting to me that the banner survives the change in band in this period, right? Because, this is a period where he's broken up the experience. He's pretty, this band is an example of like, what am I going to do, right? And it comes out as the Band of Gypsies, but that only holds together briefly. Any thoughts on why the banner would survive the musical exploration he's going through in that time to break out of the experience model?
No, good question. And he, it is a miracle actually that Woodstock set was as good as it was, right? I mean, the band had only been together like a week or 2 months or whatever. So, and the fact that I think Mitchell is there allows him sort of to do the anthem maybe because he's rehearsed it, obviously done it with Mitchell a lot. And I have this chart in this article which really goes through these 60 versions or 60 performances that I've identified, and then there's pretty close analysis of the 40 that I've listened to on tape. And there's a big gap, right? So basically, he does Woodstock, he plays the Block Association Party in Harlem, where he plays the anthem, plays Purple Haze, and calls it the African-American anthem, or the Negro anthem, I can't remember what he says exactly, but then he doesn't really perform at all publicly, right, until maybe January, I can't remember exactly, but he's recording a little bit, but he's sort of on break. But then he comes back, as I said, on this Cry of Love tour, and really plays it more frequently than he had ever in that Cry of Love tour. And I think really the questions for him as an artist, I think the song is, and all of his music is really tied to who he was. I mean, not in a way that's maybe exceptional to other artists, but for him, certainly very deeply identified with his own identity and what he was trying to do and who he was as an artist. And clearly those questions still remain in a certain way, because he didn't have to play it, I don't think there's nothing that the audience is calling for the Star-Spangled Banner on the Cry of Love tour. I mean, he's playing it and then the audience is reacting to it, but it's not that the audience is demanding that he play that. But I have to think about that more deeply, because I do think there are some larger questions for him, and it may be that it's related to Machine Gun, and it's related to this whole anti-war message, I think, and his sort of growing political consciousness. I mean, I deal with the same thing with Gershwin. What if he had lived a few more years? What would we know? What would we have? What would the banner have become? Because he was still playing it at 50% of his concerts up to his death. So there's no reason to assume that it would have stopped. So I really wonder where it would have gone, had it had the chance. But I do think it's very deeply involved with his own search for identity, and that's really why I love to share this with my students, because I think they're searching for their identity too. We all are in a certain way. We're always reinventing ourselves, and artists like Hendrix give us that kind of example for what music could be and help us figure out who we are. So, and I guess that's the ultimate thing. I do see Hendrix's version as one of the greatest ever performances of this song, in part because I really don't believe there's a traditional version. I mean, one of the things my recording project showed is that the way Francis Scott Key heard the song is not the way we know the song. I mean, he did not sing it the same way he did. There's a choral repeat in the original sheet music that we don't sing anymore. So it's, and they would have sung more verses probably, and it was much more sort of classical in style. So the song is always talking about who the creator is. Francis Scott Key is doing the same thing. I mean, he's looking out over Baltimore Harbor. He's seeing this, he was, one of the things we didn't realize about Key that I think is really cool is that Francis Scott Key was a resident of Washington, D.C., right? He lives in Georgetown. And so when the British burned burned D.C. to the ground a month before Baltimore, who is in the militia that's called up to defend D.C., and who fails miserably at defending it but a guy named Francis Scott Key. So he was in charge, because he was an educated lawyer, he was in charge of an artillery division, or artillery group, as division would be an exaggeration, but because D.C. is a little piddly town at this time. It's created by the Articles of Confederation, right? It's not created, it's not a son, it's there because nobody wants to be there, and it was land that everybody was willing to give up, right? It was not valuable farmland, it was not a big port, there's nothing there, it's a swamp, right? So it doesn't have a big town, there are not a lot of people who live there, so when the British come, there's not a lot of people to defend it. Baltimore is a different situation. Baltimore is one of the major cities in America at this time. It's one of the three biggest. So they rise up and repel the British, and Key witnesses this. And he then writes his own hopes and aspirations. We see this song as very natural today, very symbolic of who we are. But for Key, it's a dream, just as much as Hendrix's Woodstock banner is a dream. So I really see what Hendrix did and what Key did as part of the same story of artists giving their vision for what this nation should be, and then hoping that people rally around that vision. So I think with the mistake is to see Francis Scott Key, what we think of today as Francis Scott Key's thing, as like a done deal, right? Because Key's writing of that lyric to a Musicians Club anthem from London was an act of citizenship. It was an act to try to make an individual making a civic statement. Hendrix is doing exactly the same thing. So when we sing the song today, we have to remember that we're actually, and it's cool that it's a song, right? We have to sing it or it's not alive, So we are doing the exact same thing, and we have to put our own vision into that performance and our own citizen act in the same way that Hendrix, I think, was doing in Berkeley when we performed the song. So for me, it's something that's just as alive right now as it was for Francis Scott Key on September 14th, 1814, and as it was for Hendrix on August 18th, 1969. Thanks, this was great.
Well, thanks, Mark, for a fascinating talk. We want to thank the American Musicological Society one more time for making this joint series possible. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for watching online. Let's give Mark one more round of thanks.
It's a thrill for me. Thanks so much.
A whole lot of other people haven't been living for a while. I'd like to dedicate this to all the soldiers fighting in Berkeley. You know what soldiers I'm talking about. And, the soldiers fighting in Vietnam, too. We'd like to dedicate to them. And dedicate to other people that might be fighting wars, too, but within themselves, not facing up to the realities.